So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This time I'm going to begin with a question. Are you a cat person or a dog person? I know. I kind of know most of the faculty, but, whichever you are, or neither category quite describes you, welcome and thank you all for joining us for the very first public lecture of this academic year. Our theme for this year's lecture series is leash. So the follow-up question is, have you ever tried putting a cat on a leash? I know someone did. That is a peculiar proposition. We might think of being unleashed, or in the case of a cat, simply refusing to participate in the whole regime of the leash as an act of untethering from control, a gesture of freedom, perhaps even a small act of anarchy. And some of us may feel at times that we are leashed to our disciplines, to norms, to conventions, or to particular ways of thinking and making. And leashes, importantly, have also been instruments of violence and control. It is a delicate subject in part because leashes themselves can be indelicate. But if we dig a little bit deeper into the word, we find that the roots of leash are about a slack rather than taut connection. The word comes from the French lazy as a lazy affair, like let it be, and further back in Latin words laxus, loose, open, slack. Think of being lax, a lax approach. Think of a line hanging loosely between 2 points, a catenary. So we might pause over the possibility that the leash is internally conflicted. It restrains, but it also permits movement. It establishes a relationship while leaving room for distance, wandering, and negotiation. You may know the famous line by Paul Klee, a line is a dog that went for a walk. And perhaps to take our dogs for walks, we need a leash. So throughout the year, we want to ask, what kind of leashes do we design? What objects, ideas, people, materials, and disciplines might we bring into new relationships with one another? And what might we discover in the loose territory of the leash? That's a long theme introduction. My name is Cathy Danjiang, for those of you who are new. I'm a faculty member in architecture and I'm also part of the college's programming committee together with Faye Nixon and Carlos Stradel. Our lecture series is generously supported by the Robert B. Church III Memorial Lecture Fund, and this year's posters are designed by Slovenian designer Nate Prow. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the year, Lindsey Wikstrom. Lindsey is the founding principal of Mattaforma, an award-winning architecture and design practice based in New York. She is the recipient of the 2026 National Design Award for Emerging Designer from Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, the winner of 2025 New Practice New York competition, and she has been recognized among the top 40 under 40 by the World Architecture Festival. Mattaforma was founded around the idea that architecture can cultivate new relationships with nature. The practice is particularly interested in bringing landscapes of production, the places where materials are grown, harvested, processed and made, into closer conversations with spaces of consumption, our buildings and cities. This relationship between where things come from and where they end up runs throughout Mattaforma's work. The practice has developed an impressive body of projects engaging plant life, plant-based materials, and found materials to create environments capable of growing, changing, and adapting over time. Their work ranges from residential projects to institutional and cultural spaces across different regions, including here in the East Tennessee. Alongside her built work, Lindsey advances regenerative approaches through research and scholarship on material innovation, biodiversity, and non-extractive processes. She is a leader in mass timber, bringing questions of forest sourcing, extraction, and material supply chains directly into the scope of architectural design. I first became interested in Lindsey's research through her drawings and essay, 3 Material Stories, published in Embodied Energy and Design, Making Architecture Between Metrics and Narratives, it was published in 2017. And I have to admit that I got very excited at first because in that work, she was really seriously talking about the criticality of instrument and representation, and how a word mapping technique can be used in making visible the relationship behind materials, their geographies, movements, energies, and connections through this idea about a metric vision. And the questions of what a larger system to which material remains tethered was developed further in her book, Designing the Forest and Other Mass Timber Futures, published in 2023. Lindsey is a frequent public speaker and has taught at Columbia, Yale, Cornell, and Syracuse. She holds a Master of Architecture from Columbia University, where she received the McKeith Prize and the Avery Sixth Award. And she was the winner of the 2016 SOM Traveling Fellowship for Architecture, Design, and Urban Design for her project titled An Immersive Catalog of Housing Systems. And I'll stop right here. Please join me in welcoming Lindsey Wikstrom.
Wow, that was a really extensive bio. Thank you so much, Katty, and thank you to the committee, and welcome to all of you to this new school semester. It's super exciting to kick off this lecture series with you all. I hear we have 4 schools in the house. Is that right? Okay. Which is really exciting for me because I also consider my practice to be interdisciplinary and cross-discipline and collaborative, so I'm super excited to hear from all of you, hearing your questions and your thoughts, towards the end. So I'll kick off with this lecture, and it's mostly about research. I'm happy to also open up the conversation about practice. This is a more academic point of view that influences the practice. We had this great conversation before coming into the room, and one of the things I shared was that this research sets the trajectory for my career. So when I was a student, and I graduated in 2016, the drawings I was making as a student launched that career and started to create a roadmap for myself. And then all of these projects that become built form are these steps along the way, that trajectory. So I'm very happy to share that with you today. So choreography. Let's just take a moment. I'm also 6 months pregnant. This is really kind of awkward to be lecturing with the same kind of energy that I typically do because my body's doing all kinds of funny things, which is interesting because that's kind of on the topic here. So we'll kick right off. So choreography, when I started as an architect and was asked to be critical of spaces, I was in a university much like this, and I looked around the room. So let's take a second to look around the room. We see wood, we see carpet, there's plastics, there's metal, there's electricity, water. All of these materials came from somewhere and are heading somewhere else. They're not going to be here for 1,000 years. They're not going to be here permanently. It feels very permanent because we are in and out, in and out, in and out, and we exist in a time pace that's so different than materials. But what if we as designers could make decisions that map that really understand that are really conscious of that movement, that all of these materials are paused right here in this room, but they're headed somewhere else? What would the practice be like if we did that? If we really considered time, energy, and space and bodies, less like, dance moves, but dance is helpful, to be more of our material palette? How would we approach design? So I'll kick off with one of my first projects I was commissioned to do when I started Mattaforma was an actual dance space. This event space in Brooklyn was one of the event spaces that's part of a larger cluster of offerings by an amazing group called Public Records. We immediately clicked with them because they are, like a lot of farm-to-table folks that you might know in the industry, like restaurant industry, are obsessed with sourcing. All the ingredients must come from a particular place. When you go to the grocery store, you also might be obsessed with sourcing. Has everyone bought eggs recently? Right? You go to that, I love... Yes. You go to that aisle, and it's like a wall of sourcing options, and you have to place yourself in that wall of ethics. What level of chicken torture can you handle, right? So that is how I think about architecture, and that's how they thought about ingredients, and didn't really think about that when it came to their spaces, their physical spaces, because it's operating at a different time scale. And I said, you can absolutely bring that obsession right into the space that we're designing here. So this is called the nursery. But before we launched into the people spaces, they really wanted a very functional greenhouse. They wanted a nursery to overwinter their plants. So we very diligently said, we will do that for you. That is the first thing that we will do. We won't worry about anything else. We're going to fulfill the brief. So we interviewed all the plants. So we cataloged them all. What species are you? What do you need to be comfortable in the winter? What's the temperature? What kind of sunlight do you need? What's your pot life like? And then we used grasshopper, because I'm an old person, to simulate the kind of heat retention in the space. The materials we used were shipping containers, so they absorb heat differently than polycarbonate, which lets heat through, and then the wood. And so then we came up with this space that was about keeping the plants, and then we thought, but it can do so much more. We're generating this little passive battery system that's got its solar orientation. It has, winter sun coming in, summer sun is not necessarily being blocked, but it's going down. And then, wind is coming through. We have like ventilation through the space. We can start to create like more connections. And it was through simple ideas like adding plant life, where we started to think about this tiny little space, it's like 2,000 square feet, as a tiny ecosystem. And so suddenly the project, the brief, was much more about a community of plants, a community of people and plants now living together. And we worked with this landscape architect called Cactus Store, and they've only done two projects in New York. This was their second project. They're based in LA. And they don't bring this New York nativist point of view. They're from LA, which is designed. It's like, what should we curate for the space? What kind of plants should be here? And with them, we started to create this narrative about what does the new native of New York mean when it comes to plant life? Instead of sourcing a tree from the Adirondacks, they actually source this tree from the top of a Japanese mountain, species-wise, because it's actually more native to a rave than the Adirondacks, which is so impressive to me. So it's really good at surviving under movement and cigarettes and maybe dog urine. It's so much better at that than what you might find upstate in these like picturesque places in New York. So this really challenged our notion of what it meant to create an ecosystem here. And it turned out it was really productive for butterfly migration, bird migration, and it tapped right into these existing ecosystems. I mean, there's much bigger research about that, non-nativeness and questioning what it means in landscape architecture. I'm sure you all can give me a lecture about that, the landscape architects in the room. But I'm curious about that, especially as the climate changes, what that means. So when it comes to wood, that's our real expertise. That's our obsession. And here, for this project, their point of view was off-the-shelf Brooklyn. And so when I think about bespoke wood sourcing, I'm sure the picture comes to all of your minds. You want to go out into the woods and cut down the tree, like source the exact tree, find the perfect tree, cut it, sawyer it, dry it. You kind of go through the whole supply chain process. But the brief was to not do that. The brief asked us, source us the best wood from Home Depot. And so we said, yes, sir, we will do that exact thing. And it has to do with cost, but it also has to do with their brand, their story, being about existing material supply chains. And so we learned a lot about Weyerhaeuser. Weyerhaeuser is one of the biggest timber companies in the country. They always have been. And there's pros and cons to every one of these companies. But Weyerhaeuser in particular was interesting because they were the first ones to invent this idea of regenerative forests. They're one of the only big companies today that sources regionally. If you're in New York, you can't buy Pacific Northwest wood from them. You can only really buy stuff that's grown and sold in like West Virginia up to the Northeast. And so that was really impressive, and it was just lumber sitting around. We just didn't know the story. And so now we can add this value to the design and to their brand. And so also, I mean, one other detail of this project is that, so we, collected these shipping containers. They were on the site. We called them our free walls. And we designed Pratt trusses, because Pratt truss also feels like it's celebratory in its geometry. It was all handmade on site. And we, for the construction documents, the builders didn't speak English. And so we made pictures and instructions, almost like an IKEA drawing set. And they made the tilt-up truss on the site, and we were there when it went up. And they had this like tear in their eye. It's like, it's the fastest, easiest construction I've ever been a part of. And it was just so touching to connect with people throughout the process, for that to be something that they enjoyed, made a huge difference to us. And so this space today, it's aging, it's being used for all kinds of things. People get married there, celebrities get married there. I never see those photos. But it's a really well-loved space, and it was just an empty lot before. It, with a few moves and a few stories, became a new kind of life. And so I want to transition a little bit to different kinds of commissions and practice, and what it means to maybe be an architect today or a designer. So this commission was, what year? I don't know the year, 2019 to 2020, around then, and then it lasted to 2023. So MoMA commissioned me to create a speaker series, because they had never done anything about sustainability or environmental design before. And this new institute at MoMA was called the Ambas Institute, headed by Carson Chan in the middle. And he said, all these people, you're tapped into everyone's research, let's bring them all together and have this multidisciplinary conversation about the future of materials. And so we did our best to catch a global conversation. And after the fact, it was 13 episodes. We had 100 people join from all over the world. And after the series is called Material Worlds, highly recommend, but it's also probably already out of date. But at least you can get exposed to the folks working in different industries. So we have concrete, and we have plastics. There's obviously a mass timber one. But for example, the mass timber episodes, it was the old FSC president who shared his thoughts, and now the thoughts have changed. So just keep that in mind. But I did this map of, a map, I was gonna pat myself on the back how global this series has been, and it revealed huge gaps, which I bring it up here to show you, be aware of your bias, be critical of yourself in iteration. How are we really, what are the stories that I'm hearing that I'm carrying through into the future so that I can be aware of it? Gaps, massive gaps. So this was super helpful for us. Possible headlines that came from the Material Worlds episodes. There were some really amazing ones, but some already came true. I asked at the end of every episode to the designers, what do you think the next 100 years holds for our discipline, for the world? And some of them said amazing things like, we're going to start mining plastic. We're actually going to turn to structural stone because we realize that concrete is lame, that it's actually just cooked stone, and so it's not as good. We're going to realize that the mangroves are a critical infrastructure and invest in that. So there was a lot of really critical, amazing thinking and visioning. But the big conclusion that came out of this series for me was this change in mindset. So when we're thinking about the word sustainability or environment or climate consciousness, I think I would challenge us all to stop saying this first question. Is this material sustainable? Is this carpet sustainable? is this sustainable? Because it's so relative. And right now we have LEED and we have different kinds of metrics that tell us, don't worry, it's sustainable. But even those metrics are written by people that have their own agendas, their own groups to answer to. And to be aware of that is to question the definition of the word. And so I would love for us to be more explicit. Who are we sustaining with this design for how long? Because once you set those boundaries, those limits, then you're really getting into some honest work, I believe. So like Hattie mentioned, one of my first projects, what set me off on this trajectory of thinking about this as a practice, is 3 material stories in 2017. These drawings was like the first time that anyone had ever drawn digitally or by hand a 6-point perspective or equirectangular projection, or what you might think of as a 360 drawing. And the point of this is to invite designers to have a say over the whole material flow. So what I was saying at the beginning, like, we need to be thinking about this movement. This is a drawing, we can do that. We can draw the flow of materials in one piece of paper, unroll it on a desk like a world map, and redline it, have a say, design it. So suddenly there's a drawing type that allows us to see into that flow, which is typically an externality. It's typically so abstract, even more abstract than a building section, which is super weird. Like cutting a building in half with your mind, that's a weird thing. It's a similarly weird thing here, to imagine how materials come out of the ground, move across the ground, move across water, are changing state with people involved. Who's involved? Who's in that room? How can we make it better? And the whole reason that this, to me, is so important, and it's the generating energy behind my practice, is because right now, so we have global carbon emissions, and this is a little bit, a few years ago, but it's still largely true. Building operations, so the energy it takes to heat and cool and light, artificially light, this projector and all these lights in here, that's building operations. So right now that's more energy. The fossil fuels are burning for that energy than the energy it takes to make all these materials to get into this room. And that's even more than all transportation combined. So we have planes and cars, all of that effort to avoid having cars on the road. It's less impactful than running our buildings and building our buildings. So our power in this room to have a difference in the built environment is massive. Even if 1% was reduced, it would make a huge difference. Like the equivalent of cars off the road is massive. And so what's this number here is embodied energy to get the materials to the building site, specifically just these 3. So concrete, steel, and aluminum contribute 23% of global carbon emissions, which is more than all transportation combined. And building operations is going down because efficiency, energy efficiency, trends with capital. In other words, you save money when you use less energy, which incentivizes anyone who's building a building to use more efficient systems. It's the opposite with embodied energy. We're incentivized to use cheaper, more mineral-based materials today, which means that number is only going up unless we use regenerative materials. So that's the kind of issue we're facing. And then not to get more bleak, but here we go. The reason it's important to be a designer today, and the really amazing, I'm so grateful that all of you are in school to be part of this discipline, because we need you now more than ever. There's so much construction happening on the planet that needs to be influenced by you. Whether you are there or not, it's happening. This is New York City, the very top, all 5 boroughs. And every year, and this is the amount of construction predicted and tracked by the UN. This was a release in 2019, so it's been true. There is 1 New York City being added to the planet every month. That's how much construction's happening on the planet. Every month, New York City. And that's every level of every tower. It's not just a flat Google Map view. It's built area. And so that means that if all of those buildings are made from concrete, steel, and aluminum, there's an equivalent hole being dug somewhere else on the planet that's also that big. Every month. Massive. Something has to change. This is what we're looking at in the next 40 years. Something has to change. And there's amazing reports about how we can make this change. This is one of many. This shows mass timber. So every little bit counts. If you change one column into a material that's regenerative, you've made a difference. If you change a whole building, you've definitely reduced it. And then here's where my questioning of sustainability starts to come in. A lot of branding is happening, like a storytelling around mass timber is happening. You might see it on the internet. If you Google mass timber one time, you'll start to receive all of the stories. It's gonna burn, it's not gonna burn. It's like, it's a lie that they say it's net zero or whatever. Everything takes some energy. There's no silver bullet in the world. I hate to break it to you. There's no building that doesn't require energy to build. But let's make sure that energy goes somewhere great and actually helps improve the landscape it comes from, rather than mine from it, extract from it. Can it actually be reciprocal? Wouldn't that be amazing? It sounds like a dream. So I'm going to stop here, with that prompt. What time do we have to be? I just want to make sure but what time? I could really go. 6. Okay, I'm going to skip this part then. So I'll tell you, this is just Googling mass timber, and some of the things that come to mind when I started writing about mass timber and reading about mass timber, and then eventually published my book on mass timber, was a basic question that you probably all have or will have. Is it really that much better? So we went through the embodied energy argument, but what about deforestation? What about water? What about pests? What about fire? What about biodiversity? All the mass timber that's available today is only a couple of species. If we incentivize that, we're just incentivizing monocultures. And then what about aesthetics? Do we want to just be in wood spaces all day, every day? It's kind of intense. Are we ready for that? There's a lot of questions. And I will be happy to hear your questions at the end. So keep them for me. So bear that in mind, right? There's questions, there's challenges. I don't consider, when I go into mass timber world, I want to know what's real, what's the truth out there, what does the data show, and what's possible. This is a fantastic graph from Bruce King in collaboration with Arup. And, if I was you and I'm thinking about timber design or what to do in studio or how to approach your careers, just print this out and have it on your desk or something, because it's a graph of caring. This is a graph of how your caring changes carbon emissions in the planet. So we have on the left the extraction of materials from the ground. We have the manufacture, transport, construct, service life, and the end of life of a building or a product or a space, whatever you're designing. If you do that with concrete or mineral-based materials, which, sheetrock, these things are included, immediately you'll be emitting carbon, because also concrete's not grown, right? So it starts at manufacturing. It's manufactured, which is a clinker, it's cooking, it emits tons of energy. They can't redesign that. When you hear green concrete, it's it goes from this to that. It's very minimal change, which is, every little bit counts, but it's always going to be up there. Worst case scenario for timber design, worst case scenario for timber design is like a tired, very tired person at their desk, right? It's just let's just make it timber, and I gotta go home now. Timber design Like, I'm not going to do any research. I'm just going to type into the notes wood. Very minimal, right? I've been there. It's still better. It's literally better than the concrete. Every little bit that you research more and become more intimately familiar with how to do sourcing well, you are sequestering carbon, literally. The amount of hours that you care about the subject reduces emissions on the planet. Enter my book. This is where I created this book as a primer for students, but everyone. You know, people who read this book include folks who own sawmills as like a 5th generation owner and want to change their approach. This is also read by architecture students, design students, but also people like my parents who don't know anything about design thought it was interesting because it's about timber in the world, it's about landscapes, it's about trees. And I think that it connects a lot of people that maybe didn't have connection before. So this is a picture that I always kept on my desk too. Manhattan was a cultivated landscape. Manhattan was designed by the Lenape through cool burning and cultivation, planting trees, cutting trees. Forests have this long history of being human-occupied and actively managed places. So the first question when I started this book, when I started teaching studio at Columbia, was whether we can build everything we build in New York City out of New York State trees. Can we do it all with mass timber? Is it enough? So it was a depletion question. Would mass timber deplete the forest? Is it possible? Okay, let's get into it. This was also a scientific paper that was sponsored by the UN Environment, which I presented. It was the only paper in that conference on biodiversity. It was very interesting. So we have New York City, 50 million square feet of built area every year. We're not going to even reduce it. Let's just say, fine, let's do 50 million. This is how much wood we have in the state. And I just chose the 3 most prolific species, because there's tons of different species. But this is the most prolific. As soon as you start to ask, when will this wood become available to harvest, you're into a political question, which is like so fascinating to me. When is an eastern hemlock mature? We have economic maturity. It's mature when it fits in my sawmill. I have a saw this big. That's when it's mature. Then you have the conservationists that say, well, you know, natural regeneration happens on a cycle that's a little bit longer than that, so we want to wait till it drops the seeds. Other people say, we'll just do that for it. We'll plant it. We'll harvest it early. It's immediately complicated. So this is a very simple view, but I kind of landed in the middle. It's a pretty long time span. But you have to understand when this material, if you're not mining, you're not just going to get it whenever you want. You have to understand when it comes online. When can I go get this from the forest? And then how much do we need? So each of these species has a different density that can grow per acre. This is another super simple view, right? Their canopy is a certain size. Their volume, the trunk is a different size. The height is a different size. And all of that generates a different volume that can be used in mass timber. So right there, if we're thinking about climate conscious design as an optimizing problem, we're already kind of on the wrong track, because maximizing diversity is really the only way to engage biodiversity. If we're optimizing and we're just maximizing, we're just going to be doing red maple cities. And we just have only that, right? Because we're trying to maximize how much we harvest. So somehow in our equations, we have to try to tell this story about why harvesting less productive places or species is super valuable. And then this one got a little bit funky when I exported it. But you know I didn't use AI at least. So when I drew this, I actually drew this. It's a little bit old. So another kind of optimizing problem is that each of these tree species, it's coming online at different times. So imagine it's growing and you're cutting it, it's growing and you're cutting it. That's different than the tree next to it, it's growing and cutting it. And suddenly that's tough to like track and manage, that choreography. And each of them is absorbing carbon differently. So you're like, I can't optimize for carbon. There's all kinds of metrics happening here. But even if we just stick with these three, forget about maximization, and look at how often they come online, we can say how much is available in a year. And we can say easily that we can make even more built area without depleting anything. It's actually just tapping into the cycle of the forest. So suddenly the mass timber problem or challenge is no longer a mathematical one, scientific one. It's much more about a social one. Are we willing to make this our future? Are we willing to work across private property lines and manage a forest as a group rather than about as individuals? Something like this. Can you imagine that? Because forests are also so much more complicated than mining dead pieces of lime that go into concrete. They have social ties, they have fungi, they have habitat for animals. And it's much easier to say, I don't want to touch that, it's too complicated, you know? But what's amazing is that as humans, this kind of activity, engaging with ecosystems as a part of design, saying we're part of nature, we want to be part of your cycle, let's design this together. We have done this for a lot longer than we have been addicted to oil. A lot longer. So here's one example of many of a society 6,000 years ago, Amazon, that was, the society and the forest was designed at the same time, co-located. And they're finding amazing pollen records that show huge swaths of forest as cultivated, planted, designed, regularly harvested for building materials, fuel, food, all kinds of things. And so that forest has always been part of us. We've been part of it. But then, you know, colonization, industrialization, suddenly the forests we were designing weren't co-located with the people who were being sustained by that design. So in other words, you know, here in India, we're seeing probably Great Britain come in, redesign this forest, so remove native forest, add new plants that are going to be harvested and shipped elsewhere to sustain that group. This is a sustainability project. It's just not for people who live here, right? And we are inheriting that cycle. We're not that far off from that cycle. So toilet paper, paper products, you know, I like to say all wood is good wood, but once we start getting into how to improve that, right, trying to push that graph to maximum care, we really need to take a look at these industrial forests because they're extracting tons of water. There really truly are no habitats there. They're taking advantage of labor conditions. There's a whole section of the book on questioning those places and starting to retrofit them. And also not retrofit only, but try to figure out how to measure them. How do we tell a story about what that is, besides that it's just inheriting a colonial forest? Because our current strategy today isn't that much better. One of the most amazing tree projects is the Billion Tree Project or the Bond Challenge, which asks countries to sign a petition saying we're going to plant 1 million trees, 1 billion trees, numbers. Counting trees is the way that we're currently measuring this effort. But when you incentivize just trees and numbers, you incentivize cutting down old, scraggly, ugly, giant, dumb trees and planting 1,000 new trees that are all young and have no connective tissue. And that's still how we think about good practice today. So how do we start to say, older, multi-generational, mixed biodiversity forests is what we want to maximize for. How do we start to tell that story? That's what we want to see in the world rather than numbers. That's a really hard thing. It goes from a quantitative metric to a qualitative metric, which is tricky. So one of the only things that, there's very few tools for this. This is definitely the cutting edge, I would say, of forest ecology today, and also climate science, because it's tough to understand this in the context of the built environment and other things about the world, right? There's a handful of folks that are tracking individual trees and putting sensors on things, and that's starting to help a lot. This one is LiDAR, so we're trying to measure diversity, biodiversity with tools, and turn it into metrics that we can read as numbers in spreadsheets. So, you know, these groups of people here have written down for you, for all of us, what do we think is good wood? What do we think it means to source wood well? Here's our definition, and it's a great shortcut. If you're that tired person at the desk, it is a great idea to just say FSC certified. Can't go wrong. But if you're trying to push that curve down and care more and reduce emissions more, I would look at the text. What is the definition? FSC has been all over the place, around the world, and in order to protect a definition of wood, you have to police it. And so they send people around, and a lot of the wood, because it's policed, is now more expensive. And then when wood becomes more expensive, the label gets used for wood that's not FSC certified so that you can sell it for more, and then the policing continues. So how do you get outside of that? Another example is SFI. This is an American version. Also, similarly to FSC, talks about labor conditions, talks about biodiversity, talks about great things. It's a text that was written by Weyerhaeuser, a company that makes money selling one species, Douglas fir. And so, although their idea of regeneration was phenomenal at the time, because before them, companies would cut and run, which was the phrase. Now they're said, no, we're going to stay here and make generational wealth. That's our innovation. And brilliant. And so, like, the text behind this definition is about making sure their system, like their process, stays protected and valuable, right? These are all by design. So, you know, when we unroll the map of who's involved in defining what each of these steps of processing that timber goes through, it's a very small group of folks, and we're inheriting this definitions of value. And so I would welcome all of you to step into these roles. What does it mean to make a more ethical forest, building, sawmill? And I've met some really amazing folks that are doing this exact work. Saying things like, I have a friend in Portland who got a research grant mapping Black-owned forests only. And so creating a certification that you could then add that to your spec as a designer, as an architect, because architects aren't buying material. You're telling folks where to buy the material. But then in order to do that, you have to go through the process of having that data gathered. It's just not gathered. It's really tough to do when you're under these crazy deadlines. So this is a whole massive systemic shift that I would project and hope and wish for, you know, as we go forward in the future. And folks like Design for Freedom, it's an interesting group that they're kind of all over New York. They're based over there in Connecticut. They talk a lot about labor conditions, specifically modern day slavery, being in all material supply chains and in architecture. And it's one of my research topics I worked on when I was a student and then went on to collaborate with Who Builds Your Architecture. We did a book, we did exhibitions on this, that these kinds of supply chains are not exempt, especially in the US, which I think here, somehow the US is exempt in this map that they made. I would just, say that it's not. And it is really easy to think that way because, we don't really want to admit that we have problems like really close by. And one of the things that comes up, for example, is like firefighting. Fires in forests are part of forest health timber investment. The people who go out there and do that are forced labor today still. And that's part of a design. We have other systems that we could turn to, which I'll talk to in a second. But I just want to say too, it doesn't, just because you're sourcing locally, doesn't also mean that it's exempt. So like the example from the very beginning of the talk, Weyerhaeuser sourcing regionally actually had more labor protections than some upstate sawmills. So it's something to keep, on your mind when you're trying to care, when you have that capacity to care more. And then, okay, so I'm going to talk about 5 examples of how this is working in the world. It's not just wishful thinking, it's things people are actually doing, examples that you can look to and point to and build on. And the first example, I haven't done this in a lot of my lectures. These are my projects. And I wanted to share them as like hope. Like every single project has a little piece of that story that we tackle, but we're also not getting paid to do that. We're getting paid to do an event space, a hospitality space, a home, a master plan, or a site strategy as we call it, new design for a building. We're bringing that as the way we practice. And that has a certain limited capacity when you're talking about a fee. And I just want to be super upfront about that. So this is why it's a 30-year, 50-year, hopefully story with the practice and with you all, to contribute to it. Another way to think about design, so roads, simple human occupation today. Here's a map of the Northeast. It's kind of like south of New York. All of these purple lines are roads. And here's a photo I took upstate in an old logging road. So the trees that you see on the right side are deciduous trees, and the trees on the left side are softwood trees. Softwood trees are evolutionarily very old, a lot older than deciduous trees. They evolved to depend on wind and water to move their seeds around, and that's how they migrate. So that concept, when I heard that, really sent me for a loop. Whole forests are moving as well. So all these materials in here are moving, forests are moving. I worked with a forest called Black Rock Forest near New York. They had a site that was 100 acres, and they tracked 13 species of trees within 80 years, one human lifetime, that entered and left the site. So they're also not going that slow. They're racing north, is what scientists say, because of climate change. Deciduous trees are smarter, more agile. They evolutionarily evolved to rely on animals and humans to move their seeds around. And so they're much better at moving around with climate change. We're going to lose a lot of species without what's called assisted migration. And one of the things that I learned when I interviewed the FSC president back in 2020 was that they didn't believe in assisted migration. Because the FSC, for example, I think their attitude has changed, but it was really eye-opening. The FSC, they're made up of timber companies that make money on the land that they own, and it's really important to retain value. So imagine owning a house, and your house is walking slowly off your property. And you're just like, it's cool, you can go. I mean, that's scary. That's really scary. So there's really no support, and it's not that they're evil or something. It's like, I don't want to admit that my house is walking away from me. I just bought it. So this is an issue. Like, how do we design roads that don't prevent migration? How do we assist trees in moving? What does our design do for that kind of movement? One of the groups that's doing this and has been doing this for the last 180, 160 years is the Menominee. So in my book, there are these maps, And the maps, any bit of color is a forest. So all the white is not forested. And the kinds of colors are the owners. And every owner has a different interpretation of value, which is just also a wild concept. And you can see the different interpretations of value in the aerial. So right here in the yellow, that's tribal land, that's Menominee. And they're surrounded by the state of Wisconsin, which is all like privately owned land. And when they were put on the reservation, they were the first indigenous group to create a sawmill. They were the first one in the United States. Well, in this whole territory, it wasn't the United States really, like as we know it today. And it's been operating as a sawmill ever since. And they're harvesting from their reservation and selling the logs. And so when they started that process, the chief, Oshkosh at the time, he said, only harvest in a straight line and only take down or sick trees. That's the rules. That's our interpretation of value. Don't clear it. Just do a straight line from end to end and then turn around and only take sick or already down trees. And so they said, like, that's our forest management plan. We're going to do that. They did it for 160 years. And now it's more biodiverse than the entire region. So they're harvesting constantly, selling timber, and actually improving the habitat of their land. It's a great example of what's possible. Another example is, how do we cross property boundaries? This is in upstate New York. It was kind of depressing at the end of that scientific paper to imagine we can't do it. We can't even agree among neighbors where to put the trash bins, let alone how to manage forests over generations. How would we do that? Where do we look to? What's the example? So in the Pacific Northwest, this region underwent a lot of cutting up by the federal government, in part to remove indigenous occupation, simultaneous to investing in the railroad. So it's called checkerboarding. If you've never seen it, totally look at it at Google Maps. It's wild. And the checkerboarding creates forests that are chopped up and not contiguous. And that means that managing them is a real nightmare because things come to a point every mile. I mean, it's really tough to have any kind of even watershed approach. And finally, they're having this collective where all of these landowners are coming to the table to decide how to manage, and it's making a huge difference. So you have the edge of the collective seen next to the edge of a non-collective, and it's already improving. And one of the big things that they decided on is to bring back indigenous coal burning. So when I say indigenous, there's so many groups that lived in North America, and in Australia and all these places, they were burned intentionally for generations, for thousands of years. They were burned intentionally, like this, really small burns, because what that would do at the time was cut the brush down so you could hunt deer, would make the soil really good for berries. It was a way to make like a really good relationship with the forest. But when European settlers came, like fire was kind of like evil and bad and scary because they just didn't understand it. And since then, it's been kind of outlawed. So the fact that this has started on the Pacific Northwest is amazing. And it started in Australia as well. So there are places that are great examples. Last example, a forest that can sue you is for sure the best forest that you can source from. So if that forest has what's called legal personhood, it can tell you, I don't like what you're doing, and I'm going to sue you. And what's amazing is that corporations in the US, in the world, corporations have legal personhood. We already decided that a long time ago. Corporations can say, I don't like what you did, you offended me, you extracted from my property, that's illegal, and I'm going to sue you now. And these kinds of natural resources, but even that word, right, is extractive resource. So like these places like a mountain, a river, we really shouldn't be allowed to just buy a mountain and blow it up. You know, doesn't that seem kind of crazy that we can do that? And also imagine not impacting our neighbors downstream, downwind. We live in this climate fluid planet, which we're all becoming very aware of, I think, you know, in this generation as things heat up and change and weather becomes extreme. And we also have a lot of information from the rest of the world about our actions and the effects. Suddenly this becomes much more important. This was first, well, this idea has been around for thousands of years, but it was talked about in this book by Christopher Stone in 1972, Should Trees Have Standing? Legal standing. And that was the kind of first time it was talked about in more Western communities. And here's an example of a forest that has legal personhood. And what does that mean? It means that you have actual humans. So I had to go track them down on Facebook because I wanted to show you their faces. Like the list of people is one thing, but this is like a guy, a woman, you know, these people who go out to this forest. This is their job. They get paid a salary to go to this place and listen to it. And look at the data and engage scientists to better listen to it. How can I better listen to this forest? What does this forest want? I'm its representative. I'm here representing this forest. And then they get together and say, here's what we heard. Here's what I think the forest needs. You're right. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, let's cross-reference and let's decide what this forest is about. And they decide on things like, we need a harvest. We need a harvest. We need to burn. We need more recreation activity. It's definitely never, we need to fence it off. That idea is a very Western thing, preservationist attitude. I mean, I have a whole chapter on that, but I'm looking at the clock. So when we're talking about this unrolled supply chain, revealing all these steps, every little bit has this little design piece that's ready for you guys to come in and say, what should we do here differently? So overall, like to reduce the negative impact on our built environment, we for sure should build less. I'm sure you've all heard of the moratorium on new construction. I think that the idea of that is a good one. Let's question if we need to build stuff, but know that we will build something. We for sure need a lot of buildings in this world. There's a lot of building happening anyways. So when we do build, let's make sure to source regenerative materials from a place designed with cultural and environmental resilience in mind and keep pushing that line down on the graph. So thank you. Okay. So now I'd love to hear from you and have all your questions, Caddy. One right behind you and then pass. Yeah.
So I was curious, what's the time span difference for growing and using mass timber versus conventional materials? And also, what's the cost difference?
Okay, so time difference is amazing. It's no time difference because trees are maturing every second. In the US, we're actually growing surplus of wood. We don't even have a timber market that could touch the amount of wood that grows in this country. It's unbelievable how much wood is available. So it's actually more of an issue of aesthetics. Like we need to create a market. We need to get people interested and excited about wood. Then we can worry about timing or depletion. Cost is a very interesting topic. I was speaking with some faculty before. There's this project in Atlanta called Ponce. Is that Ponce? Yeah, Ponce City or something. Developed by Jamestown, amazing mass timber project. I was on a panel with the developer, and she wanted to have locally sourced, like state-sourced wood in the project. And she kept specifying that. to the builders who were bidding on the project, and it kept coming back so high. Why is this so expensive? It's just down the road. Like, just drive down the road and get the wood. I don't understand why it's so high. And she said, this just can't be right. So she packed up her team, probably from New York, like, let's all get on a plane. I'm going to go to the sawmill. So she flies down, like, drives down the road, goes to the sawmill and asks, you know, are you guys charging like 3 times like the amount? And they said, no, we're normal prices here. And it revealed that the builder, and this is the case for every builder, anything that's just different is 10x or 3x or something. Anything that's outside what they've typically done is more expensive because it takes more brain power. You got to make new relationships. There's all kinds of new threads that have to be woven in this tapestry, and it's easier to kind of disincentivize a client to just throw numbers at it. And so people usually call this the green premium with sustainability projects, and it could be real, but it also could be not real. And what a pain, because then somebody has to go fly and like check. So it's a great question. Yeah.
Where can we source regenerative materials for our own personal projects?
Like really, like to build with or to think about?
Both. Let's do both.
I think I think so many places. I mean, like I mentioned, where you can go into a Home Depot, as a thought experiment, go in there and see what those companies are. Some of them are like Ukrainian, Russian-owned, from forests that were taken in the war. Some of them are literally local, so it's a mix. I think learning about what's out there is a good start. I've heard, there's so many interesting ones. I've heard of reclaimed wood from barns is a cool thing. That happens in New York all the time. Reclaimed wood from scaffolding in New York is another thing. So reclaimed wood can also be an interesting project, like from reuse sources. But then if you get into species, there's some really interesting species stories happening out there. Like hemlock is getting decimated by the woody adelgid. The ash borer is ruining all the ash. And so I recently used ash on a project, and I got 2 prices back, talking back to the cost question. One sawmill said, it's so rare now, it's more expensive. And the other sawmill said, it's garbage, it's cheap. It has wormholes in it. So it was really, I mean, I thought that was so fascinating because everyone is just interpreting it differently. There's no standard. It's just a personal approach, just like their customer base. I would call the sawmills around you to see what's going on with them. And then a thought experiment, you know, can grow out of that too, that reality, that on-the-ground reality. Some of the sawmills that I've visited still sell like ipe from Brazil. And that's a bizarre thing to me too. We're still importing a lot of like super dense, really rare, like almost endangered wood because the thinking is that it's more durable because we kind of don't know about our own species. But then I love to think about like the realities of things like carpenter bees and other beetles once you've installed the wood, because you know they're getting decimated in the forest by beetles. Doesn't really change when it goes onto a building. We still have beetles and bees that are eating the wood more prolifically than ever because of climate change and warming temperatures. So now suddenly wood that was dense also has to be pest resistant in new ways, weather resistant. My thought experiment is like genetic designed trees that can become an answer to a lot of these issues so that we can use regenerative materials that last. But typically that takes a long time. There's so many things. Yeah, you can yell.
Okay. No, to your last point, I had a related question because I lived in Utah for a bit, where so many of the Christmas trees, whether you buy them in-store or you even get them through Facebook Marketplace from a dealer, they're coming all from Oregon, unless you're literally chopping down in place. and I believe almost 100% of them are genetically modified. So I was curious, how does FSC, like all these equations, how do they map genetic modification already or not?
Yeah. That would be a great project to map FSC with genetically modified trees. So the most information I know about GMO trees are trees similar to the tree we specified in the first project. So any tree you see in a city is actually a patented product. It's called like a cultivar. I had to go reach down deep for that one. Yeah. So if I were to go and take a seed off of a hemlock in New York City or, you know, a different tree there and like plant, I would be kind of committing a crime because it's like, you're copying something that's a patented thing. And they're all genetically modified to resist like cigarettes and urine and all this stuff. And they're all genetically modified to not reproduce. And so this has just been going on forever. So GMO trees, there's like no problem. I mean, it's really not even that crazy. It's probably way less crazy than food or just less political because nobody really looks at it. So I'm wondering, like, what else? Let's do more then. Like, more GMO trees. How do we deal with that? And another example that comes to mind is Iceland. So there was a New York Times article about Iceland. Iceland famously has no trees, if you've ever been there. They're having an issue with soil erosion because there's no trees. And because the weather is getting more and more extreme, they want to introduce trees, afforest. They want to add trees. And there's a lot of narratives then that pop up like, well, there used to be trees, like the Vikings cut them down. What did they cut down? And then there's this other narrative that says, how do we, forget the past? We want to plant trees that are going to last for 100 years. What is going to last? And they look at what's out there and like nothing's going to last. So they're faced with this question about like GMO, non-native, for afforestation to save their agriculture. Super interesting. Yeah, great question. Tell me when you figured that out. I think you had.
Yes. Hi, I'm Eden. I'm a third-year student in the BARC program. In multiple studios that I've come across, or that I've been in researching precedents, I've come across projects or materials that have been labeled as sustainable or biodegradable or biophilic. But usually I've also found that they have a lack of a clear plan to like break down or architecturally compost these materials, if you will. So my question for you is, how is material not only established and organized as biodegradable after implemented in the design, but also removed and treated when it has a lifespan or a date of expiration?
Yeah, it's so hard. It's so wild. This is also one of the biggest debates in sustainability worlds and spheres in the world, because you'll have one camp that says long-lasting life should be optimized because we don't want to spend all this energy to make something to have it die in 20 years. We want it to last 100 years. Well, what materials last 100 years? Minerals. Because they don't biodegrade naturally. So if we're only measuring for lifespan and durability, and usually zero maintenance, it's basically this room, right? Like sheetrock, plastics, rubbers, metals. And those, Europe has rolled out tons of new laws and incentivization around just that, maximizing lifespan. So all of Europe is going in this direction, which is wild. At least they're measuring something, but then you have to show that it can be broken down or recycled or reused in some way, or it's coming from a post-consumer source, but it's typically incentivizing things that are mineral-based because of that. I think that's an issue. It seems like it's a big issue because the embodied energy to create mineral-based things is way higher at the beginning than regenerative materials. So then we're really sacrificing the now for the later, when now is the most of an issue. Like what we do right now, well, 20 years ago, but right now is really important and like urgent, right? So in this urgency, my kind of like just between you and me, I wonder if a lot of that thinking is about admitting that we're not going to make our goals and that we simply need to adapt, and that reducing the global carbon emissions is not possible. Because why else would you incentivize it, right? So then on the other hand, we spend less energy to get a wood product, then we have to deal with it. Like, and that's the thing that we as humans are kind of not interested in. We have to wash it, like reseal it, clean it, like track it, and like, are you okay? This looks like you need some help. We have to like look at it instead of just throwing our laptops on it and just like and then moving on, and it's very out of sight, out of mind. I don't really care about this thing. And so that's to me the bigger question. It's less of it's less of an even embodied energy question or carbon, tons of carbon. It's like tons of carbon. I don't know what that is. I don't know what 10 tons of carbon is. But what I know is that if you care more about something, it's going to last longer, and it could be biodegradable or biogenic. But we also are kind of uncomfortable with death as like a general problem in society. We're kind of uncomfortable. So imagine designing a house for a person, spending a bunch of money on a new house, and you're approaching that meeting and saying, I really want to help you design the ending to this, right? That's not really we're not really excited about that as a design project. I want my house to live on forever. Like, I want to live in a stone house. Like, I want it to be, I don't want to admit that I'll ever die or change or, address this. So I think we have a lot of issues with our own, like, bodies, relationships. My dream would be that we treat our buildings like our skin. Like, we wash our skin, we take showers. Like, we don't have a problem with maintenance. We just haven't really applied the stuff we're good at to, like, other materials in the world. And I think this is very, like, a big generalization, but, like, Japan is an example of where maintenance and death are part of culture. It's a big generalization, but there's a lot of history there about wood buildings being rebuilt over and over and over again as an exciting thing that's interesting. And so making the process, like with my truss, joyful or part of a story that people tell, less about like, we did a job and I got money and I came home. It's like, I was part of this process and we worked hard and we saw it go up. There's a different culture there. What I've found so fascinating about studying sustainability is that it's just like nothing is what it seems. When I was teaching during the pandemic, I asked Al Gore's daughter to talk to our class because she was the leader of his sustainability campaign. So when he was running for president, he had, what was his like tipping point narrative? We're at a tipping point. Everyone should be scared. And like nobody was scared. You're at a tipping point. We're about to die. Like tipping point. And it didn't work because it's like, how does this affect me? It's the same thing today. I'm not really moved by math or numbers. I'm moved by things that impact me on a daily basis that I find are beautiful or meaningful or memorable. And so what does she do? She is now leading a group of people out of like a lab that's based in a church in New York City. So the church is kind of part of Columbia University. And then she runs a lab there that's all about bringing legislators into religious ceremonies conducted by indigenous folks. so that they can have an appreciation for things like water. That's like her main focus. Because creating that gratitude is where real change happens. That's what she talks about. So like Wild West. Thank you for that question. Good to see you again. We saw each other earlier. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. No worries at the time. Yeah. We're going late.
Hey, Lindsey, thank you very much for coming here. I really appreciate your passion about the subject. And that got me really curious because we heard a lot about your work, but I feel like we didn't hear as much about you. Was there a specific time in your life or event that made you really curious about sustainable design? And a kind of more fun question, if mass timber wasn't available for you to use tomorrow, is there another material you're very passionate about?
Yeah, wow, cool questions. I'll work backwards. So I think all materials are interesting and important. I mean, we have to know about everything. And, you know, in our projects, we still specify like concrete foundations. We're not sitting there asking people to build with stone, you know, dry stone pack, like bespoke, traditional, ancient things. They're just like, we just need a barn, you know? So we're just, I think, you know, this is why the bigger picture is what it is. Like, I would love to get there where stone foundations is easy. Wood foundations, which exist, are like no problem. But we're still not there. So we're trying to chip away with each project. And so I still have to know how to design with concrete. You still have to know how to design with steel. You still have to know, you know, if you're going to work, I did like public classrooms. You've got drop ceilings with lighting, and, you know, you still have to do a lot of great design with those materials. But what's interesting too is that each of these worlds, like there are drop ceilings that are a little bit better. There's some concrete that's a little bit better. And so knowing those incremental steps helps a lot. If I had to switch like from mass timber to something else, Material Worlds as a series is an example of all the different other materials that are their own worlds of exploration. So structural stone is a huge one. Mycelium is another big one. I just posted on Instagram recently. We did this like learning about straw roofing, like amazing material, working with cob or earth. I'm from the Southwest, so rammed earth is a thing there, but it's still mixed with cement. Like, how can you use different mixtures to avoid that, different lime conditions? Right now on a project where we wanted to do stucco, but stucco is just cement. So now we're looking at like hydraulic lime, and we're talking to these builders. We're like, what? Hydraulic what? I'm like, your website says lime plaster. They're like, I've never heard of hydraulic lime. Because it's so ancient, we just like forgot. But once you do it right, it lasts 3 times the time of stucco. So there's this like kind of lost knowledge that I want to find these people that are carrying this around. It's like a language is about to go extinct. So that's on my mind. And then a time that I thought sustainability was interesting, you know, in grad school, it never came up. Like not even one time. It was only when I was asked to teach. So I graduated, then went into teaching studio, and the prompt of this course I was going to teach was, it's the first time students will be exposed to the landscape. Because we had done all 3 studios of urban sites. And then suddenly, like, what should we do? There's topography out there. There's trees out there. Like, what do you have to say about that? And you know, at the same time, I noticed that at Ivy Leagues or, you know, universities in general, but in New York, nobody wanted to address mass timber as a topic because it was like trendy. It was too specific. And even colleagues of mine said, are you sure you want to call your book that? I was like, definitely now that you've said that. I mean, it's a problem. Like, let's talk about it, you know? And all of the students were ready for that. Every single student wanted to be in a class where they learned about actually designing with actual materials that are new. And that's why I think we're at the beginning. I mean, I talk about this a lot. At the beginning of this new material era, concrete is like 120 years old. Mass timber in New York is 3 years old. So we are babies. We are just learning how to figure this out, and how exciting. You get to have a say. So to me, that was a huge deal, and it was a big missing piece at the university. Thank you for the question. I think we have to wrap up. Thank you all.